Welcome, everybody, to Create Your Best Life with Rex. I'm Rex Sykes. I'm your host, and I'm thrilled to have my guest today. I'll be bringing him up in just a second. It is Dr. James Blair Hill. He was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, and he is the son of David Hill, the youngest son of Napoleon Hill and Florence Hornor. He graduated from high school in 1996 and spent time at sea on a cargo ship until 1969 when he was drafted into the service with the United States Marine Corps. From 1973 to 76, he attended Vanderbilt University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. At graduation, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and commenced service in the Marines as a field artillery officer, and he later earned a Master's of Science in Mathematics from the Naval Postgraduate School before teaching at the United States Naval Academy. As an officer, he held command twice, led a team of military advisors into Southeast Asia, briefed the Soviet General Staff, served as an aide-de-camp to two Marine Corps generals, and served in many critical billets at the battery, battalion, and regimental levels. He's certified in scuba, mountain, cold weather, and jungle warfare, and is a graduate of the Army's Command and General Staff College. In 1995, Dr. James Hill retired from the Marine Corps after 26 years of service to study medicine. At the age of 53, he graduated from medical school and started a 3-year residency in family medicine. Dr. Hill is board certified in family medicine and holds certifications in wound care and hyperbaric medicine. He retired from medicine in June of 22 and lives with his wife and 2 children in Bridgeport, West Virginia. And he continues researching the life of his grandfather, Napoleon Hill, and is putting together the Napoleon Hill Papers. And for more than 20 years, he's been writing and speaking about Napoleon Hill's science of personal achievement. And his association with the philosophy began at his age 12 when his grandfather placed a copy of Think and Grow Rich into his hands and told him to read it. However, more than a dozen years passed before he understood the extraordinary nature of his grandfather's gift, and what Dr. Hill learned from reading Think and Grow Rich changed his life twice, once when he was 23 and again when he was 25. So I want you to help me welcome Dr. James Hill, a man who definitely knows something about leadership and has pursued it in many different ways. Good afternoon, my friend. How are you today,
I'm
sir?
fine, thank you, Rex. Thank you very much for those kind words.
Well, I'm so glad that you are here, and I feel like I won the lottery having you here to be able to talk about your grandfather and to talk to you and to pick your brain a bit for our audience in terms of your family background and what your grandfather did when he wrote his books and how we can apply that in our lives today. So I really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
So why don't we just start in, and if there are people showing up and they have questions or comments, we will take those as they come. This program is always streams live, and then it's available in replay at my YouTube channel, Create Your Best Life with Rex. And so people who are watching live or in replay can share the show out and encourage others to watch. So one of the things that you have done in this research is to address some of what's out there. You know, there are always, when anybody does anything, there's always detractors, and certainly Napoleon Hill has some of his own. And you've answered some of the detractors' allegations, essentially. And one of those allegations was, before we even say that, you raised the point, for example, how do you prove something after the fact? Like,
Absolutely.
It's pretty hard. It's like prove you don't have a boat.
Rex, I've thought about that a lot when I've been researching my grandfather. I once briefed the Soviet General Staff, heroes of the Soviet Union. And I did that about 30 years ago in Hawaii. Now, how do I prove that I actually did that now? I mean, short of having somebody that saw me do it 30 years ago, how do I prove it? I mean, I can prove that I was a Marine Corps officer. I can prove that I was stationed in Hawaii 30 years ago. I can probably prove that the Soviet General Staff came to Hawaii while I was stationed there. I can prove that I was in a billet that might have given that particular lecture or that briefing, okay? But I cannot prove that I actually did something that's as indelible as marrying my wife in my brain. I can't prove it. And that's the trouble, with so much of what Napoleon Hill said and done. I can find out, as I tend to go out and look for any information, whether yay or nay, that supports his allegation. I'll give you an example. Napoleon Hill often said that he gave FDR the words, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." But we all know that somebody else wrote those words into Napoleon Hill's speech. So the question is, well, how did FDR's speechwriter get those words? Could he have gotten them from Napoleon Hill? And so I'm looking through archives and letters, and I find a letter from the chief of staff for FDR. And he had written Napoleon Hill 3 weeks after the inauguration and thanked him for the information that he had been providing FDR, and thanked him and said that FDR has already started to use that information. And then I can show that there were other correspondence letters between the two people. And Napoleon Hill was closely associated with the FDR administration for at least a year and a half. I think he said it was 2 years. So that's the kind of thing that I do. I go back at it, A lot of people wonder about Andrew Carnegie. And so when I looked at it, at the meeting with Andrew Carnegie, I said, well, when did he start talking about Andrew Carnegie? Was it just when he wrote Think and Grow Rich? And the answer is no. He was talking about Andrew Carnegie at least 10 years. In 1917, he published a book in which he said he had a letter from FDR. Not from FDR, from Andrew Carnegie, and that was 2 years before Andrew Carnegie died. And so I looked at it harder, and I said, well, Andrew Carnegie was retired then. Was he even in the United States? Napoleon said that he met him in November of 1908. So where was Andrew Carnegie in November of 1908? Well, it turned out that on the 30th October of 1908, he arrived in New York City aboard a steamliner with his wife and daughter. So, years later, how would Napoleon Hill, without an internet, know when Andrew Carnegie was there? Second question is, well, okay, Andrew Carnegie was available, to Napoleon Hill to meet, but how would he get the door open? Well, it turned out that he wrote that he had been given a letter of introduction from Bob Taylor, who had a magazine called Bob Taylor's Magazine. Well, could this letter of introduction open the door to Andrew Carnegie? Well, it turns out that Bob Taylor was Senator Robert Taylor from Tennessee. He had been a two-time governor of the state of Tennessee, and his magazine was just something he did on the side. So if anybody could have opened the door to Andrew Carnegie, it would have been a sitting U.S. senator, and that's exactly who Napoleon Hill was in correspondence with. Now, how do I know he was connected to Rob Taylor? Because he published a magazine article in Bob Taylor's magazine, which occurred in October of 1908. So I go back and I find these things and say, is it likely that he could have done it, or he couldn't, or could not have done it? And I pretty well substantiate that most of what he said, I'm finding good, strong evidence to support what he said.
Well, it raises in my mind, I have never, living in Los Angeles and growing up, I have never thought to take a photograph. I was always being photographed or, at parties or things, but I never took an actual photograph. And when people say, do you have pictures or something? I go, no, they're all up here. And that was long before I had children, and and thought, oh shoot, I should have taken pictures so I could pass them to my children.
Yes.
But I mean, and I've lost all phone books. I've lost everything. There's no way I could prove anything about my time when I was, in my teens and 20s and 30s in California. And the reason why I say that is it just didn't even dawn on me. Now, in 1996, I went to a marketing seminar in Los Angeles. And the guy said, do you have a wall of fame? And I go, what's the wall of fame? He goes, well, pictures of all the celebrities you're with. I said, well, no, why would I want that? He goes, so that other people find you credible. I go, well, why do I need that to be credible? He said, well, because other people want to see you. I had never thought about that. I never asked for autographs, never really took pictures with anybody. I was just, So I would also submit that back in Napoleon Hill's day, it might not have been the kind of thing that you think about doing as much as we do today, where now I mean,
Oh, yes. Well, there is that one picture of Andrew Carnegie standing next to a man that is purported to be Napoleon Hill.
right.
And but a lot of people, the naysayers, say, well, that's not Napoleon Hill. But I have a picture from 1909, okay, that shows a man, that's my grandfather, who looks very much, if not exactly like the person standing next to Andrew Carnegie. But that's out there. I mean, I throw it out there. I don't know if people bother to read it or not, or see these pictures that I found.
Well,
So,
I love it, and I think when we find when we come across something that you posted, say on Facebook, some new thing. I mean, we're all of us who love the works of Napoleon Hill and love your furthering our experience of Napoleon Hill are always delighted when you're sharing something. I mean, we feel privileged, and it's an honor to be able to share in that with you and your family. So these detractors have said, when he didn't know Carnegie or he didn't do this. What about the Wright brothers?
oh, yeah, Napoleon Hill wrote. He'd write these stories, and people a lot of time disbelieve them because they sound, like they're impossible. In 1909, the Wright brothers, one of the Wright brothers was in Europe doing the same thing that Orville Wright was doing in Washington, D.C. Orville Wright was trying to sell a contract, his airplane, basically to the Army as an observation plane. And he had there was a stipulation the Army wanted for an airplane. They needed to be able to fly a passenger, and Orville Wright did, with one passenger and fly 60 miles an hour for 1 hour. So Orville Wright went to Washington, D.C. to prove this. He actually went first in 1908. Before he got there, I'm sorry, he was practicing for this in 1908 when he was developing his plane. So he was at Fort Myers near Washington, D.C., and he had a Lieutenant Selfridge, was his name, who agreed to fly with him as a passenger. Unfortunately, they crashed, and Lieutenant Selfridge was killed in 1908. The lieutenant was the first passenger, the heaviest passenger to ever fly in a plane up until that time, and he weighed 175 pounds, and he was the first passenger to ever die in an airline accident. Well, anyway, Orville Wright spent a few weeks in the hospital. He got out, fixed his airplane. In 1909, in July of 1909, he flew to Washington, D.C. to show his plane and what he could do in the Army. Well, Knapp always wrote. He said, "I went out to the field where the Orville Wright was, and with some newspaper men, and I volunteered to fly in the plane." He said, "I got to fly in the plane because I was the lightest person in the audience." Well, if you know Napoleon Hill history, you know that he weighed about 125 pounds in those days. So he said that he got to ride in the airplane with Orville Wright, and he said when they landed, he had to raise his feet off the ground because he would have gotten mud and bushes and grass on him. So is this true? Well, is this true? Is what he said true? So I did a little research, and I said that was a big event in 1909, and I found that in July of 1909, 29 July, I think it was, Orville Wright flew from Fort Myers to Washington, D.C. And I think it was the Washington Post sent two newspaper reporters out to interview him, and they were driven out to the field by Napoleon Hill in his EMF touring machine, which is a car I know Napoleon Hill owned. So Napoleon Hill drove two newspaper people out to meet Orville Wright. So he had an opportunity to meet him. And remember, Orville Wright needed to find a passenger for his airplane, which had been fitted with skis to reduce its weight. And so Napoleon Hill could have flown with him at that time. I can't prove that he was the guy who got into the plane with Orville Wright and flew around, but certainly he was where he should have been, and the contract stimulations were exactly what he reported they were when he wrote about it decades later. So it's an interesting story. Yeah, he did that. He said he had to raise his feet off the ground to keep him out of the weeds and mud.
Wow. Well, personally, I don't care. I mean, if he did or didn't, it doesn't detract at all, in the very least, from the work, the philosophy, wherever it came from, if, came from Carnegie's mouth or came from other sources. I just like what he compiled because it's useful, and the Laws of Success, and then subsequently, Think and Grow Rich is an easier read than the Laws of Success, but then he also has other works, and studying the way he put things together. And I love the way he organized Think and Grow Rich. I think that's the masterpiece in getting people to understand. I mean, Laws of Success was a little more difficult to get through, a little drier, perhaps, but he takes you on this path to be able to pick up all the important things as you go along, and so you're gaining an experience as you move forward with the book. I know some people read it like a novel; they read it to get done with it, and other people actually do what he asked in both volumes, to study it and to highlight and underline and take notes and to return and to reread and to, so, if you make a study of it, it's certainly a transformative book. Before we move on, though, to those kinds of topics, about the philosophy that you understand it as, I guess one of the last director questions I'll ask now is did he die broke?
Oh, I love that one. I love that one. There's somebody on the internet that has a picture of Think and Grow Rich, and it has an equal and then a pile of manure. And then he said, well, Napoleon Hill, this, Think and Grow Rich is a pile of this, is what he was inferring. And he said, Napoleon Hill died broke. Well, that's an interesting statement to say from someone that hasn't seen his will and doesn't know anything about the finances of it. I can show that I have his will, actually looked at it, and it shows he had zero assets when he died. Oh, that's interesting. Why would he have zero assets when he died? Well, the reason is, according to the law at that time, there was a substantial estate tax on all inheritances. So he was married, and what he did was he and his wife had joint accounts. So that when he died, he had zero money because they belonged to both of them, and she inherited everything from that way. So you have to look at her estate when she died 14 years later. And if you look at I've forgotten the exact figures, I think she had about $165,000 in cash and about $75,000 in equity in the home. But if you translate that to $2025, you had about $1.2 million in assets 14 years later after Napoleon Hill died. And that didn't include any of the royalties or intellectual rights to his works. So unless his widow got rich real quick, right, then he died and left her some money. I can also show that in the last few years of his life, he was in a franchising mode. And I just looked at the letter. I just found the letter yesterday, the day before yesterday, in which he sold some franchises for Napoleon Hill academies. And he was given the $100,000. He was going to be paid $10,000 a month for 10 months for the rights to franchise New England. And if you take that $100,000 and translate it into 2025, it's over $1 million. So yeah, he had money. The same people that say that Napoleon Hill died broke are the ones that show pictures of him and say he's a con man because he practiced law in Illinois in 1922, and he didn't have a law license and never went to law school. And they stopped there, but they never bothered to look to see what the law was in Illinois in 1920s. It turned out in 1897, the state of Illinois said if you wanted to practice law, you had to have a high school diploma. But it wasn't until 1931, all right, that the state of Illinois said that you had to have a license to practice law. So all you needed was a high school diploma and a little bit of experience, and Napoleon Hill certainly had both of those to be able to hang up not your diploma, hang up your office advertisement and practice law. He didn't do it very long because there wasn't much money in it for him. But yeah, I see that all the time.
Well, there's the term chronocentric, which essentially, like egocentric. It means that we tend to apply our time to all times throughout the world and assume that everybody thinks and acts and behaves the way we do because of how we live today. So we look back in those days and without thinking about it.
That's right.
He must have gone to law school then. And,
Well, his father was a dentist, and he practiced dentistry for 2 years before he went to dental school. All right. In fact, he went to dental school, and he was so experienced, he graduated in a 4-year program in 2 years at the top of his class. That was Napoleon Hill's father. So I mean, they didn't have the laws and the regulations. Remember, it was the Hatfields and the McCoys, were only 10 years before he was born, and it was a rough time when Napoleon Hill grew up.
This is going to be way off base, but I argue that, and I went to look it up the other day. Typically they say, biblically, a generation would be between 20 and 40 years. So I went, and I've known this for I don't know how long, and I looked it up the other day, and it said between 20 and 30 now, I guess they say. So if you went to the Civil War from 1865, the end of it, to 1885, and another 15 years to 2000, you've had one or two generations, that were there. And then say 1920, maybe you've had three inside of 100 years, you're lucky if you have 5 generations.
Yes.
And all of those generations are going to pass along from grandfather or great-great-grandfather to grandfather to father to mother to daughter to son to grandchild, great-grandchildren. They're all alive almost somewhat simultaneously for a while. They pass along their knowledge, their experiences, their prejudices, their biases. I mean, and so it takes a long time to get past some of the things that we wrestle with today, like why do people maintain these ideas? Because we're only 100 or 200 years removed, but that's really only a few families, in terms of our evolution.
Yeah, this is a funny story. I have a letter from my great-grandfather, Napoleon Hill's father, to my grandmother. And you have to put it in the context of the time that had the Irish immigrants coming into, taking jobs out of the coal mines in Southwest Virginia, which Napoleon Hill grew up in that area. And lots of Irish and lots of Italian laborers coming in who spoke a foreign language, and they were all Catholic. So my great-grandfather was anti-Catholic. He was a proud Mason. He said, we've got to do something about all these papists that are coming into the country, Florence. And he said, whatever you do not let your children go to parochial school, Catholic school. So I don't know what she did, but I know that all of her children married Catholics, and his whole line downstream are Catholics. So it's rather ironic that things like that, they don't always get passed down in the way you want them to be passed.
Oh, true. Very true. Very true. I should say, by the way, that, we have this show streams to multiple locations. And I've been kicked off of Facebook, so I can't see the groups and the places that oftentimes will have questions. And if they're out, if they don't come directly through somehow to me here, I don't see them and won't be able to post them. So I say that to you, but I also say that to viewers who may be watching and one of these things and or typing and saying, answer my question. And it's not coming through to me. So I don't know what's, if something comes through, I will absolutely, post it. That doesn't mean there aren't any. And I want the people who might be asking questions to know that some kind of technical thing that I don't know what's going on. So, to me, I mean, I could sit here and just listen to you all day long, talk about Napoleon Hill and his family and his history and, the different and things that we, rarely get to have the curtain pulled back and see. We just read the books and get to know a little bit about the philosophy that way. But let's do that if you would. Let's talk about his philosophy, because you read the book and you say that it changed you 2 times, in your 20s and in your 40s. So how did he happen to press a book into your hand and tell you to read it, and then what you did with it for a while?
The story is I was 12, but I just found out a couple of days ago that I was actually 13 when I saw him for the first time. I had the year wrong. And the reason why I found it, I found a letter from his wife, Annie Lou, to my mother, thanking her and for our visit Napoleon Hill and thanking her and telling her that she was bearing 3 fine children. So I know that it was, and that was the date of the letter, that I was 13. When we were leaving, my dad had a Volkswagen Beetle, a little white Beetle, and my dad was in the driveway, and the door was open, the front door was open, and I was in the middle seat between my 2 sisters because anyway, I was in the middle of them. And Napoleon had a white long sleeve shirt but no tie. It's the only time I ever saw him without a tie. And he came out and he was talking to my dad, and then he went over to the car with the front driver's side was open, and he leaned in, pulled the front seat back, and then handed my sisters and I a copy of Think and Grow Rich. And inside there was a $10 bill, and the inside cover was a lot of money in those days. I remember working man. Well, he actually said this. He said, there's $10 here, and remember when you spend it that's a day's wages for a working man at $1.25 an hour, and that's what it was. And he said to read it. So I did. I read the book, and I loved the stories in it, but it didn't have any impact on me. Then you jump forward. I liberated myself from my parents early in life, and I was making my own decisions, and I was living with the results of my own decisions. Hence, I was drafted into the Marine Corps. I was at Camp Lejeune, and I was very, very lonely. And I had one trait that I inherited from my grandfather, and that trait was I outworked everybody around me, always have. Okay, and so I had made rank, and I was very successful as a Marine. But I was also very lonely. I think there were about 25 girls in all of Camp Lejeune. The rest were Marines. And I was going home one night on a Friday night from work, and I stopped at a Piggly Wiggly, which is a grocery store in North Carolina, South Carolina. And I got a 6-pack of beer. And I'm at the checkout counter, and they had one of those little turnstile things with books on them, little paperback books. And all of a sudden, I saw Think and Grow Rich, green cover, paperback. So I just took that as my grandfather's book, and it dawned on me. I said, why don't I read this again? All right, so I took it home with me, and I read it again. I had an open beer, and then I started reading the book, and I read it. And the more I read it, the more excited I got about it. And I got to the end of the book, and I said, I'm missing something. I'm missing here something. So I started over. This time I'm writing all over the place. I'm writing, underlining and writing notes and stuff. And I get to the back of the chapter where they talk about excuses, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And I said, this is me. This is me. So there's a phone. Sorry about that. So anyway, I decided then and there, why don't I just take my grandfather's advice? Why don't I do what he told me to do, what he told all of us to do? That was my legacy, same legacy he left the world, his book. So I said, I don't know, but I know I need how to proceed, except I know I need a definite major purpose, and I didn't have one. So I took out a piece of paper, and I wrote down on that piece of paper everything I ever wanted to be in my life. I want to be a spaceman, a policeman, a fireman, a cowboy, whatever. No, didn't matter how ridiculous it was. I wrote it down. And then I looked at each one of those things, and I said, oh, this is ridiculous. I really don't want to be a cowboy anymore. And I can't become a doctor. I don't have the grades or the money to be able to go back to medical school. I can't become a spaceman because I don't have the skill set, and I'm not in a curriculum where I can, in a pathway that'll lead me that way. So on that list, I had finished my education. And it turned out that was the only thing that was left on the list that I hadn't marked off. Now, I marked these things off, and this is bad what I did. And I'll explain that in a second. It's bad what I did. So I said, okay, finish my education. And then I made a plan to do it. A year and a half later, I'm at Vanderbilt University, majoring in engineering, one of the top schools in the country, and I'm at the top of my class. And the reason why I bring this up is I graduated, was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and then I went to the basic school to get a little more training as a lieutenant. And the Marine Corps came down to me and asked me to apply to the space shuttle program. Wow. Now, they wanted someone preferably who was flight qualified, and I was scheduled to go aviation at the time. And they wanted someone with a technical degree. They preferred a master's. I didn't have the master's, but I had a 3.712 from Vanderbilt. And so I met the minimum requirements, and I made application. I didn't get it. Okay, I didn't get the program, but I had a shot at it. So looking back at it now, and I said, I am a doctor. I marked doctor off that list all those years ago. And the reason why I marked it off was I didn't have the grades or the money. But you see, I went back to school over my lifetime, over the next 20 years. I went to graduate school, and I got the grades. And when I retired from the Marine Corps, I had the money. So those negatives that kept me from doing what I wanted to do in life were not negatives. They were simply the tasks that I needed to accomplish in life in order to accomplish a goal. But I took them as negatives and let them stop me. And looking back on life right now, I know that don't, I know that I see so many people, I can't do this because I don't have the time. Well, you reprioritize your time to be able to do it. I can't do this because I don't have the money. Well, you get a second job to get the money. You find a way to accomplish those goals, all right, because they're tasks. If you want to achieve that goal, that's what you have to do. You really have to do. So that's how I changed my life the first time. I took Napoleon Hill on a matter of faith. The second time was I'm ready to retire from the Marine Corps. And I was at a battalion cocktail party, and my battalion surgeon came up and asked me if I was going to take. I had orders to Okinawa, 3-year unaccompanied tour, accompanied tour, and I didn't want to go overseas for the last 3 years in the Marine Corps. I was at 26 years at that time, 25 years at that time. So I said, I don't know, and he said, well, you don't seem very happy about it. And I said, well, I'm thinking about getting out. I've written to West Virginia University. And since I taught mathematics at the Naval Academy, I asked if they had any what they thought about me coming back to WVU. And they immediately wrote back and offered me a fellowship while I worked on fellowship where I could teach and work on my PhD in mathematics, because I had a master's in mathematics at that time. And my surgeon looked at me and he said, well, you don't seem very happy about that either, sir. And I said, I never thought of myself as a mathematician. You know, I just because I can do it doesn't mean that I want to do it.
Right.
And he said, well, what did you want to do before you came in? And I remembered all those years ago, I once wanted to be a doctor. So I said, well, doc, I wanted to be a doctor like you. And he said, well, you still can. He says there are age discrimination laws right now, and you can go back. He said there was someone in my residency program that was in her 40s. So if you want it and they're willing to work it, you can do this. So I wrote off to four. Actually, the story has 5, but actually I called one of them. I wrote 4 letters to different medical schools and said, these are my academic credentials. This isn't reasonable for someone my age to even contemplate going to medical school. 2 wrote back and said, we do not discriminate based on age, race, sex, the party line. And then West Virginia University wrote back and said, go for it. And said, we found that prior military, particularly military people, make good doctors. And if you're willing to do it, I recommend that you go ahead and do it. So I went to talk to my wife. She goes, "Willst thou go? I go." And at that time, the decision was made. I walked back to my office, what used as an office in those days, to pick up my copy of Think and Grow Rich. And the hair stood up on the back of my neck again. But the difference, the difference between the 2 times I went Think and Grow Rich changed my life. The first time I took the book as a matter of faith. The second time I knew it would work for me. I knew that if it could be done, that I could do it because it had already proven it to my own self. So I guess the teaching point from this is don't let the negatives be negatives. Just think of them as tasks that you need to accomplish if you want to achieve any goal.
Well, that's such a beautiful way to think about it. We hear that they're negatives and they're hardships, and they season us, and there's, equal opportunity and equivalent opportunity in the seed, seed in adversity. But to say the negatives are tasks, I love that, because people don't think that way.
They are. There's something else I've learned along the way. About 20, not 20, maybe 18 years ago. So I was at the Napoleon Hill World Learning Center at Purdue University. There was a seminar, and they were talking about definite major purpose, and they were talking about negatives in lives. So they asked us to take out a piece of paper and think about some goal that we wanted to accomplish in life, but we never did, and write down all the reasons why you can't accomplish that goal. So I took down a piece of paper, and they said, don't worry, we're not going to ask you what your goal is. So I took out that piece of paper, and I said, I wrote down, put my hand on, no one could see it. Don Green was sitting next to me, and I wrote down, become a spaceman. Okay. Now I'm 50. Okay. Become a spaceman. I wrote that down as my goal. And then they said, okay, now take 5 minutes and write down every reason why you can't accomplish that goal. So I sat there with that pen in my hand, and I picked it up, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it. And then at the end of 5 minutes, I didn't have a single reason listed. And I looked over at Don, and he hadn't written anything in it. And I said, I can't think of a reason why I can't. And he said to me, I can't either. Because the reason why I couldn't think of it, I was so involved in thinking, how do I accomplish it at my age? I can't go the normal way. It's too late to go back into the military to go it. All right, I got to get rich. I mean, the Russians will let me go up if I pay them $25 million. They'll send me into outer space. So my goal is I need $25 million. How do I get $25 million? And I don't have very much time to do it because I'm 50 years old. So I was lost in thought on how to accomplish the goal instead of thinking of why I couldn't do the goal. And that's the difference in thinking between that 25-year-old young Marine sergeant, 25, no, 20, 21, 22, 24-year-old Marine Corps sergeant, all right, taking things on faith, and somebody who had lived a life with experience and had seen the power of Napoleon Hill's work. And my mind had completely switched from those earlier juvenile thinking thought patterns, I guess, to an adult thought pattern.
Wow. Well, no, I very much appreciate that. And I think it's extremely powerful and extremely poignant, and people should take heed and re-listen to that again and again. Because typically, if somebody says, hey, you want to do this, if they think no, it's the first thing, it's either time or money or energy or family or know-how or, something. There's always the excuse that comes up of why they can't do it. And that's what takes predominance in their head at that point, then, unless they do something about it and change it. So what you just said, I'm so amazed. And William Shatner, went into space at 90. So, I mean, it's hope for any of us who want to go into space.
The second, if you look at and think and go rich, the steps for achieving any goal, what's the second step? Well, I'll tell you, it's determine the price that you're willing to pay.
Right.
If I want to lose weight, I'm gonna have to give up. What's the price? Give up my beer. Before I make my plan, I got to know what I'm willing to pay to accomplish that goal. It's the most important step, if not the last step, which is supervision. Supervise yourself to make sure you do it.
I love it. I absolutely do love it because, so many people, hear that if you can conceive it and bring yourself to believe it, you can achieve it, but they don't actually, first, they don't conceive it. Second, they don't believe it. And third, then they wonder how come they don't get it. But what you just said there is know what you want, and then what are you willing to pay to have it?
That's absolutely. You can't formulate a plan. And if you do formulate a plan without knowing the price that you're going to pay, it's not going to work, because as soon as you'd go for the refrigerator and get that beer, you realize, well, no, it's 7 days since that New Year's resolution I made. I want the beer. Okay. But you have to want it so badly that you're willing to pay the price that you know that it takes to achieve that goal.
No, absolutely. It's a powerful point. And but the other thing you said is the difference between the 21-year-old and the elder or the older you was the one time it was like, I want to believe it. I'm developing the faith, and the other time was certainty. It's been said of the uber wealthy, those people who are either silver spooners or otherwise, they've made their millions, that oftentimes they don't think about how am I going to get the money. They just think, well, I need the money. Well, because they've married, they have associations. Somebody's father or mother is, well connected. So they go, I want to start a business. It's a matter of who do we go to get it, not is it available or not. So they don't, you know what I mean? The kind of thinking or the level of thinking, whether they're productive or not, meaning some are born into it and don't do anything with it, and some are born into it and do a lot with it, and some work their way up. But the point is that the mindset isn't one of, oh my God, we're never going to have this happen. It's just like, I want it, so I'm going to have it. It was kind of the Henry Ford thing. I want my V8 engine, so I'm going to have my V8 engine. It's just a matter of when. It's not a matter of if.
Absolutely. I see that all the time in people, the difference between the achievers and those who don't achieve. I see it all the time.
Well, and I also like the Edwin C. Barnes, when he went to, the story where he goes to, to put Edison on notice, goes, Hill writes, first it might have been a whim or a wish, but it became a white hot obsession. And he goes there and he puts him on notice. And later, Edison said, I didn't hear a word he said because I can't hear, but I knew that the look in his eye was such that he was somebody to pay attention to. Well, you turn the page and it says many months in some versions, or another version says 5 years went by with no evidence that anything was going to change for Barnes. But he kept it alive. He was certain that, it would pay off. And then when opportunity struck, as as Napoleon said, it comes out of nowhere and it's not what you think, but then the rest is history. But it was because there's that certainty that you just mentioned, which is different than people trying to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps to believe something.
But if you are trying to pull yourself up, a lot of time you have to accept something on hope. A number of years ago, I was quite naive, and I was teaching my philosophy, and I said, I'm going to go down to the women's shelter here and teach this philosophy of success. So I set up an appointment. I went down and talked to the social workers, and they pointed out something to me that I hadn't thought about. Okay, because I was still a little bit arrogant, I think, about anybody can do anything. Okay. Which is not always true. Anybody can do more, but then cannot necessarily do anything. And they mentioned these women, they don't think about success. They don't think about the future. They think about safety. They think about food for their children. And until you get them into a place where they're out of the shelter and they're functioning at a minimal level, I said, you cannot, this is a waste of their time. Now, having said that, I was at we teach the certified instructors in Napoleon Hill Foundation, and I run into incredible people. I go down and teach only so I can meet these people that I'm going to talk about, and I get to meet. I met a woman at one of our seminars about 5 years pre-COVID, and she came up to me and she said, "Hi, Dr. Hill, you probably don't remember me." And I looked at her and I didn't remember you. She was African American, and she said, "I met you in New York City at a book fair." And then I remembered her immediately. And I said, "Oh, yeah, you came by getting motivational books to bring down to the shelter." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "I took you over to Rick Hanson's booth to make sure you got a copy of his book, Buddha's Brain, which is a really good introduction to neuroplasticity." And I said, "Did you read the book? Did you like the book?" And she said, "Well, yes." She said it was a little hard. And I said, "Well, it's a little hard in the back half of the book. The first half of it's pretty good." And we chatted a little while, and I said, "It's a pleasure seeing you here." And then she went back and got seated. Well, about 2 hours later at the lunch break, she came up to me and she says, "Dr. Hill, I have to tell you something." And I looked at her and I said, "Yes." And then she burst into tears and she said, I lied. And I don't really know her. Okay. And I said, "Well, okay." She said, "No." She said, "I never read Hanson's book." And I said, "Well, okay, that's all right. You get a chance to read it. It's certainly worth the read." And she says, "No, you don't understand." She said, "The reason why I didn't read the book is I couldn't read."
What? And
so I said, "What you're a certified instructor. You've got to read to get to this class for this certification window." And she said, "I brought all that after talking to you, and I brought all those books back to the shelters, okay? And we had people, social workers, who actually were reading them from those books to the ladies." And she said, "I got fascinated by it. And I looked into it, and I decided that I wanted to become an instructor. So I learned to read so that I could become certified as a Napoleon Hill instructor." It's an incredible story that someone would be willing to do that. At that same seminar, there was a man, his last name was Campbell. I won't tell you the first one. I'll give you his title, Shihan, okay, which is a 5th degree black belt in karate, Shotokan karate. He came up to me and he's in a coat and tie, and we're talking a little bit, chatting very quietly. And I looked down at his hands. He's African American, and he's got a white knuckle, one white knuckle, a huge white knuckle. And then I looked at the middle finger is a big knuckle, is white, and then he has this thick callus on the 4th finger of the hand next to the pinky finger. So I know immediately that he's karate. So I looked up and I said karate, and then he asked me how I know, and I touched his finger. Well, it turned out that he had been he became acquainted with Napoleon Hill through Bruce Lee, because he had heard that Bruce Lee was a Napoleon Hill follower. And so he looked into it, read it, and he said there's such a similarity between the Bushido code of the warrior and what we teach in karate and Napoleon Hill's philosophy. All right, when you boil it down to its essence, I decided to become a Napoleon Hill instructor so I can better teach the members of my community. And he said, I'm in the inner city in Hollywood, Florida. And on Saturdays, the parents will drop their kids off. They're going to go shopping. And he said, I teach a couple of classes. I ask them to bring a lunch and teach them a little karate. And I teach them a little success stuff. And he said, I became an instructor so that I can better help the community of people that come into my dojo on Saturdays. Yeah. And so I run into these kinds of people that are internalizing Napoleon Hill. There's a guy that goes into the prisons in North Carolina, even to this day, and teaches to inmates there, which is something Napoleon Hill Foundation used to do. And we still do through him, I guess, because we provided with all his course materials. So there are people like that all over the place that are using this philosophy to help their fellow man, not trying to get rich with it, that are using it in ways that enrich mankind.
Oh, that's wonderful. No, it truly is. It's amazing, and it's wonderful. And his reach has gone so far around the world, and so many people have read the book. And one of my fond memories was I was down at the lakefront one day with my dog, and there's this young man sitting on a bench over 10 yards or whatever. And I look over, he's reading Think and Grow Rich. And so we both just happened to stand up later at that time, to leave. I was going with the dog, and he came toward me, and I said, "You're reading a book? What is it?" He goes, "Think and Grow Rich." I said, "Wow, how did you get to read that book?" He said, "My dad gave it to me." He said, "I'm so grateful for my father to give me this book." And I just let him talk. But I mean, he was like beyond himself that his father thought enough of him to give him this book. And what he was getting from the book was so thrilling to him in terms of, presenting a life path for him and choices that he could, begin to apply, that I've remembered that for years now, and how enamored he was. And I meet people like that all the time, but this was a special occasion for me. So I can only imagine how rich it must be to encounter people like that,
all the time I run into them.
Yeah. Also, I would say that, when I first met Karen Barban, one of the things she did, she and her mom reached out to me. I didn't know who they were at first, but they reached out to me. And then as we got to know each other, she presented me with a copy of Bruce Lee's original letter to Napoleon as a kind of a gift, which I always thought was really, really special. But also to have that and read that, in his, so that was very cool.
She's a barrel rider.
Yeah, I know. We haven't spoken in a few months, but she was just pretty impressive. Amazing what she accomplishes and does too.
Her father just passed away a couple of days ago. He was a Supreme Court justice in the state of West Virginia for many, many, many years.
Now that I did not know, and I did not know that he passed away either. So
just about 2 days ago.
Yeah, no, I have to send condolences. Wow. But what a special family. It is just so good to be connected and in that regard. And we were talking about earlier before the show, about it was Blair was your Uncle Blair was writing to your father, David, about applying Napoleon's principles and about intentions, and how important it was. Would you expand on that?
Well, Blair, of course, was the second oldest or the second youngest. There were three boys, and he was born without ears. He went through college without being able to hear his professors, and he had a very active career in college. He could read lips. He could hear sounds if they were shouted. If you went up to him and shouted in his ear, the vibration, I guess, allowed him to hear. Later on in life, the hearing aids that had bone conduction were invented, and he was able to have a normal life with that. But he was he was the mature one in the family. My Uncle Jim, there were three boys. My Uncle Jim inherited the family fortune, gas company, the fortune that Napoleon Hill walked away from, by the way. But his son inherited it. And then my Uncle Blair, because he couldn't hear, he couldn't go out and work in the gas fields or learn the trades of running this company. He became a salesman and died a millionaire. He was a very, very gentle man. He was because Napoleon Hill was not in the family, with the family, for many years after. The first 10 years of their marriage, they were together all the time. But the second 10 years, when my dad it was, from 8 years old until we graduated, they were no longer living together. I mean, it was just hit or miss, hit or miss. And so Blair, in fact, became my dad's father. He was the one that saw to his finances and sent him money when he was in college and gave him letters of advice when he did all the things that young boys do that aren't good for you. I made the same mistakes my dad made. We all do, I think. But Blair was that kind of guy. He was the best of all the Hills. He had the best genes. I'll give you an example of how he always thought of other people. The day he died of pancreatic cancer. He was a salesman, so he lived that rich steaks and booze and the salesmen do. And he had thousands of friends. But anyway, the day he died, I came back from Vanderbilt University to visit him, and he was in the hospital, and he was sitting in a chair. And when I entered the hospital room, he had his head down like this. He's sitting in this wheelchair, and he was awake. He just didn't have the strength to hold his head up. And so I said, "Hi, Uncle Blair, it's JB." And he raised his head up and he looked at me. And the only thing he said was, "Keep on setting the example for the family." And his head went back down. And those are the last words he ever spoke to me, because I turned my life around and I was at Vanderbilt and an A student and all that. And I had taken control of my own life. But that's what he said to me. And on his deathbed, he was thinking of somebody else. That was Blair. Wow. There's a story, I don't know if you heard it. My grandmother once when I was visiting her one time, took me up in the attic to show me some things, and she pointed out an old Victrola, the wind-up Victrola that had a record, like the RCA Victor thing. And those were centerpieces of your rooms, of your furniture. I mean, like a piano, people would sit around it. So they bought this Victrola. It was brand new, and Uncle Blair was 5 years old or so. She told me the story. And they wound up the Victrola, and it's going around and it's playing music, and he can't hear it, but he's fascinated by the record going around and around. So he goes up to the Victrola, and he's looking at it, and he puts his hands up on the edge of it, and he rests his teeth on it, and suddenly music exploded in his brain. He'd never heard of it. Bone conduction is what it was. Right. And he went to that trough of sound and beauty so often that he gnawed like a beaver a groove in the side. And they had to turn the thing around, and he gnawed another one on the other side. But that was his first sound of organized music that made any sense to him.
That's beautiful. I mean, I hadn't heard the parts of him turning it around and the description that you made. But he writes about him, clamping his teeth down on it, listening to A Long, Long Way to Tipperary.
Oh, yeah.
You think?
Napoleon thought that he actually grew these nerves to the bones, and that could have happened. Could have happened. We don't know.
Well, I mean, the brain does take over the neuroplasticity. When I was teaching workshops in the 80s, we were talking about growing new neural pathways, and people are going, "That's impossible. The brain is like a jar. You can only be filled, and then you lose everything." And now we know, so much different, I mean, I suspect that, and I say this all the time, the ancient mystics knew you could do it. They just didn't have the language that we have today to explain it. And now we have, science tends to catch up with what we already knew and verify or debunk what we, So
people that are blind learn to hear very well. Do you know why? They actually, the occipital cortex of the brain, which is the visual cortex of the brain, is not being utilized. So rather than let it go to waste, the brain incorporates it in the auditory cortex. Right. So it recruits additional brain tissue so that it can increase the sensitivity and analysis the discrimination of sounds to be able to make them meaningful. So that's amazing. The brain's pretty good about doing things like that.
Pretty darn good. Yeah, no kidding. And wow, we're going to have to close here, but I hope that you will come back and be a guest again. I've really enjoyed this, and you're so, filled with knowledge and wisdom and experience of applying this stuff. I think our conversations could grow and take on.
That's because I'm old. I've lived long enough to accumulate a little bit of wisdom.
Well, or you could say I'm experienced.
I do have that.
You are experienced. You're very experienced. Well, I surely appreciate this. This has been a really a good time for us. It's available in replay, and I appreciate the people who are watching anywhere and everywhere. If you're trying to ask questions or leave comments, I have to do, I guess, in replay. But thank you so much for your time, JB. And I'm going to reach out to Karen too when we're off here too to send some condolences. I appreciate that. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the work that you do to continue, spreading his legacy and making parts of it that, I mean, since he's gone, we would never know, and it's through your work and through what you've uncovered and the research that you've done that we get to share in that. I really do appreciate that, and I know others do as well.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll say goodbye. I'm going to close out the show, but I do appreciate you here, and be right back.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I just want to say, everybody, thank you. To me, this was a super, super treat to have Mr. J.B. Hill here. I should say Dr. J.B. Hill here to share his experience of being family of Napoleon Hill. I hope you watch this. I hope you share it out, and I hope you will take heed to some of the things that he pointed out as we discuss the philosophy about setting a definite chief purpose and developing the certainty and knowing and how to follow through on things as he describes. So thank you for that. I also want to tell you that the book behind you is my book, Life on Your Terms. I owe a great deal to Napoleon Hill, in my life, having started reading the Napoleon Hill at a young age. So if you get my book, I just want to tell you the what I have available for you. If you buy the book from Amazon, it's a deal I've got with Amazon, but you buy the book from Amazon, you take your receipt code back to the website that you see right there, rexlex.com/book. If you go do that now or at any time in the near future, I will gift you a bonus $497 valued online training about mastery, how you master your thoughts, your emotions, your words, your behaviors, or any talent or skill you want to master. It's about learning and how you already are a learning machine, but if you're not doing certain things in a particular way, you won't be as swift or quick or as able to do what you could do if you follow the bonus program that I'm giving you, which is called the Mastery Loop, and it's how you master things. So go get Life on Your Terms. It's an incredible book. And in fact, the foreword of that book is written by Karen Barvin, Napoleon Hill's great-granddaughter, who we mentioned earlier. And it's got examples from Hill in there and stories of people who have accomplished great things in their life as a result of taking charge of their mindset and setting a deliberate intention, developing the certainty and the faith and the persistence to go through it, and then to go through it. So I invite you to go get the book now, get the training, and apply it, and you too can transform your life. Again, I want to thank Dr. J.B. Hill for being here today. I want to thank you for being here. Go ahead and subscribe to the show, Create Your Best Life with Rex on YouTube. Hit the bell notifications. When you do that, it'll notify you of upcoming shows or new videos or anything that we add to the channel. And go ahead and like and comment and engage, because that also furthers the reach. Trip the algorithms, in other words, helps the show get out there to other people who might not otherwise see it. The same thing is true about Amazon. For example, you search for my book instead of me giving you a link. Amazon is cool with that. If I give you the link to go get the Amazon book, they go, well, that doesn't trip the algorithms in the same way. So if you'd like to help yourself and help me and help others, then please go get it and go share it and go comment and go like and go subscribe. And as that said, if you consider something a problem, it is a problem. And if you consider something it's a blessing, it's a blessing. So I always say celebrate everything. And with that, I'll see you the next time. I've got an exciting guest coming up to the next show. And same time, same place, same everywhere. And we'll see you then. Meanwhile, all the best.